more waiting, we would like to start the symposium sponsored by the Suntree Foundation entitled The New Bridge Across the Pacific. We thank each and every one of you for joining us in spite of your very busy schedule. I will be your moderator. I am Sano from the Suntree Foundation. Before the start of the International Symposium, the president of the Suntree Foundation, Mr. Saji, was supposed to greet you, but it just so happened that he is also serving as the president of the Osaka Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and the former chairman, Mr. Saeki's funeral is being held today, so he had to attend the funeral. So we do hope you will forgive us that he will not be able to attend today's symposium. From the Suntree Foundation, Mr. Tori, one of our directors, will greet you at the outset of the symposium. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am from the Suntory Foundation, one of the directors. Tori is my name. On behalf of our president, Mr. Saji, let me greet each and every one of you. At the outset of this international symposium, we would like to express our heartfelt appreciation for all of you for joining us in spite of your very busy schedules. With your great interest, we have been able to hold the symposium. I pay my greatest respect to all of you, and I feel very much the great hopes and expectations that are attached to this symposium. For this international symposium, we have from across the Pacific a distinguished lineup of guests from Harvard University, Professor Emeritus Professor Daniel Bell. We also have from Harvard University, Professor Roderick MacArthur. And from Columbia University, we have the Professor Emeritus, Professor Herbert Passon. And to all of our foreign guests, we would like to express our appreciation. Our Suntree Foundation aims at contributing to the development of academic and research activities around the world. And in 1979, celebrating the 80th anniversary of Suntree, we decided to establish this foundation. Today, this international symposium will be held in commemoration of the 10th anniversary of the inception of the Suntree Foundation. Looking back a decade ago, the role of Japan in the world was taken up in the symposium entitled Japan Speaks. And this started the activities of the Suntree Foundation. At that time, too, we had Dr. Daniel Bell come all the way across the Pacific to join us. And today, from Kyoto University, we have Professor Kosaka. From Osaka University, we have Professor Yamazaki. And from these gentlemen, over the past decade, we have received their kindest cooperation and guidance and advice. In 1983, in New York, we held a symposium. At that time, the symposium was 1970s, the turning point of Japan-US relationships in the post-industrial age. And once again, we have come across the Pacific to look at Japan in Asia in a new era. Looking at current Japan-US relations, we find that it is not a favorable relationship as we have seen in the past. To try to take up the issue of Japan-US relations in a new era is of global importance. On this side of the Pacific, by looking at the issues of Asia, the role of Japan will become increasingly clear. The title of this symposium is The New Bridge Across the Pacific. In English, A New Bridge Across the Pacific. Now, this bridge across the Pacific was a terminology coined by Mr. Inazo Nitobe, whose portrait is depicted on the 5,000 yen bill. He was instrumental in conveying Western thought to Japan and Japanese thought to the West, and he himself aspired to be a bridge across the Pacific. And he dedicated himself and his life to internationalization of Japan and the world. We will be looking at the new bridge across the Pacific, whether Japan can serve to be the bridge between the East and the West. And with such expectations and hope, I would like to end my brief greetings to you. I thank you once again for coming in spite of the very early hours. Thank you very much.
Now then, may we introduce the panelists to you, starting from your left to your right. Professor Herbert Passin, Professor Emeritus of the Columbia University. Professor Passin is a sociologist who has lived in Japan for many, many years. He has his hands-on experience with Japan-US relationship. Next to him is the president of Japan Center for Economic Research, Professor Taka Kosai. Professor Kosai came from the Economic Planning Agency originally. He's a leading famous economist. He has written books about the overview of the Japanese economy, for which he received the first Suntory Foundation Prize. Next to him is Professor Emeritus of the Harvard University, Professor Daniel Bell. Professor Bell wrote books like The End of an Ideology, The Post-Industrial Society, and others, a very well-known sociologist from the United States. He has participated in our series of symposiums from the very beginning. We are very appreciative of him. Then in the middle is Professor Masataka Kosaka of the University of Kyoto. Professor Kosaka needs little introduction. He's a leading political scientist, international political scientist, who will be speaking this morning as a keynote speaker. Next is Mr. Yoichi Funabashi, a member of the editorial board of the Asahi Shimbun newspaper. Mr. Funabashi, as a journalist, spent years in Beijing and Washington. He has written books called Nave about China, for which he is also recipient of 1985 Suntory Foundation Prize. Professor Roderick McFarka of the Harvard University. Professor McFarka served as a member of the British Parliament, and he's a very well-known sinologist or China expert. He'll be speaking in the afternoon session. He has just contributed to the magazine Asteon, the latest issue, copies of which are available for your purchase just outside of this hall. He carries an interesting article about the Tiananmen incident and its aftermath. Finally, but not last, our coordinator, Professor Masakazu Yamazaki of Osaka University. Professor Yamazaki is a very active man, playwright, literary critic, social commentator, among other things. Recently at the Globe Theatre in Shinjuku, he produced a musical of all things, that We Saw Rome. A very, very famous piece. Professor Yamazaki. Good morning, friends. Thank you for joining us. The theme of our discussion today is the new bridge. We're talking about new bridge over the Pacific Ocean. As you heard Mr. Torii earlier, at the beginning of our century, 20th century, Dr. Nitobe, Inazo Nitobe, wanted to, called himself actually, the bridge over the Pacific. That's what inspired us in titling this symposium. Dr. Nitobe, in his heart, felt that Japan should become the bridge over the Pacific, and he wanted to see Japan become one. But as we convene this symposium today, are we really sure that Japan can be indeed a bridge over the Pacific, or should be the Pacific bridge over the Pacific? No, we are not so arrogant as to assume that we can. But in fact, there is an invisible bridge being structured, being built over the Pacific. That is our perception. That is the starting point of our symposium. We all know well of the importance of the Pacific Ocean and the Pacific Basin area, increasingly important as we move toward the end of the 20th century. First, this nation of the United States of America, betwixt the two major oceans of the Atlantic and the Pacific, is shifting its center of economic gravity, so to speak, toward the western part of the United States, west coast. Of course, industrial development has been faster on the west coast, and the U.S. has had closer dealing with Japan and the rest of Asia, making the United States more and more of a Pacific nation. At the same time, with Australia and other nations in the Asian Pacific region, there is a growing degree of interdependence from Europe, as in the past. These nations are becoming Pacific nations. Japan, on its part, and the so-called newly industrializing economies are increasing their economic strength. So thereby we are witnessing a sort of two economic giants, the Asian Pacific to the west and the United States in the east. In fact, we need more than one bridge, not just Japan and the United States. We need US-China, US vis-a-vis other Asian nations. We are witnessing this construction of multiple bridges across this Pacific. Crossing the ocean with bridges means people communicate with each other. People get to know each other. At the same time, it also means that there are difficulties that travel also over these bridges. And as to what these difficulties are, you know probably already full well. Our concern, our interest is how to keep these bridges intact or in place in good working orders, keeping them useful to the entire humanity. Also, the prosperity of the Pacific should not impair other regions or nations in the world. It should not be detrimental to the well-being of nations other than those in the Pacific and Asia. We like to, with some literary license, make these bridges global bridges, not just exclusively Pacific and Asian. In the morning, we'll hear from Professor Kosaka about various aspects of the Japan-United States issues. All the participants will join in discussing this theme. In the afternoon, we start with Professor McFarcart, who will present the keynote talk, mainly on the question of China. And we'll have discussions among us panelists. After the break in the afternoon, we'll try to combine both the messages or the import of the morning sessions and afternoon sessions for comprehensive discussion. It's going to be a long day, but I do hope you will participate with us with enthusiasm. With that, I invite Professor Kosaka to speak for 40 or 50 minutes. Professor Kosaka. Thank you. These days, Japan-US relationships have become major concerns on both sides of the Pacific. We have probably the most difficult time after the Pacific War. There is not a small danger that it may get worse. It is strange, if you come to think of it. The Cold War is over, and the US-led international economic order has more or less covered at least the entire world. The American dream has been materialized pretty substantially. Then, at such a time, there should be such name callings and confrontations. It is strange to me. As a subjective matter, there are problems, no question about it. Japan-US trade imbalance is colossal, and the United States has a major balance of international payments deficit, much of which is due to Japan-US dealings, which cannot be left unattended for a long time. Having said that, let me say that so far I've spoken of the objective facts. But today, Japan and United States are busying ourselves, it seems to me, calling each other names, blaming each other. The Americans think the Japanese are closed in market and exclusive, so they criticize. The Japanese criticize Americans for low saving rate and budget deficits. These arguments are partially correct, well-founded. Mutual critiquing certainly is necessary, desirable. But are we engaging ourselves in any productive debate? I doubt that, seriously. This is the case as I see it. So, how do we interpret the present US-Japan relationship is my theme. My approach, therefore, is necessarily an intellectual one. This morning, as I woke up, I was only half asleep. I walked out to the door without carrying the key with me. I went to the lobby and had to beg for another key. And I took a wrong lift or wrong elevator. Professor Bell just happened to join me, and I said to him, I do this very often. Professor Bell said, he was talking about the swimming. When somebody asks you, can you swim? I would say, I would swim, but I know the theory about swimming. That's how he would answer. Someone answered, according to Professor Bell. For us in the academia, in the universities, we don't know how to solve the problems, but I think we have some theories to put forward to. So I did make a faux pas this morning, and I borrow Professor Bell's words. So I don't know how to solve the problems, but I can put forward some set of theories, which is what I'm going to do now. 3 theories there are. 1, about the difference. How do we interpret this difference? 2nd, at the present, the situation we are in may be perceived globally and in historical context. Then what are the facts that we should see as taking place in reality, the perception? 3, foreign relations, diplomatic policies. What are they for? What can they accomplish? That's my 3rd topic. Let me take them up one by one. Recently, there is a growing body of criticism in the United States among the Americans, with the perception that Japan is different in many ways from all other industrial nations. I have little to add here, but we Japanese too tend to think that the Japanese and Americans are quite different. The only difference is the Americans speak up of this difference. We Japanese don't. That's the difference. Criticisms about Japan are legion. The government, private sector collusion designed to conquer the world, and nobody knows who makes up the decisions. Somehow, collectively, entire Japan is pursuing its national interest, and given the structure of Japan, Japan is not an open nation. So goes the argument. I cannot deny all these arguments, and I don't intend to. But this theory that Japan is different should not be overemphasized. There's a great danger in overemphasizing these differences. And I don't think they will stand detailed analysis, actually. So let me give you an example or two. This argument about Japan being different was quite active as an argument 70, 80 years ago. What was called different was, I think the only difference was Germany and America were considered so different. In the 70s, as I said, some 70 years ago, there was that kind of argument. Let me give you another example. In France, there's André Sigrid, a well-known journalist in France. In his The Age of the Americans, the American Age, he wrote in his concluding part, which I quote generally. Americans are today now creating on a vast scale an entirely original social structure which bears only a superficial resemblance to the European. Many of the most magnificent material achievements of the United States have been made mostly by sacrificing certain rights of the individual rights which we of the old world regard as among the most precious victories of civilization. This is from The Age of America, André Siegfried. This was in reference, in fact, to the mass production system that began to be developed in America. André Siegfried actually slipped his tongue and overstated the case. He said, as this mass production goes on, the rights of the individuals may be infringed upon. In this, America will be unique, different. Europeans will be closer, more similar to Asians. Therefore, dialogue needs to take place between Ford and Gandhi, he said. This part, I would say, he got a little carried over. I would like to forget that. I think it's all right to forget that part. But this outstanding journalist, even this outstanding journalist, said that much, André Siegfried. But today, America has not seized its difference. Some people do indicate that America is different, but people don't think America's problem is its difference from the rest of the world. Economic historians today consider that successes of America and Germany cannot be explained by the differences with the rest of the world. Certain degrees of universality should indeed be the key to analyzing or explaining American and German successes.
The reason why I bring out such historical examples is to show that there were overreactions on the part of the people in the past too. As for Germany, I will not specifically make any quotations, but the difference of Germany was brought about according to the critiques of that time that they had a special machinery which allowed for economic growth to go on at alarming speeds. So during the past, the United States and West Germany were cited to be different, and looking back, although not completely unuseful, we can say that it was rather off the mark. I do not want to go into more detail about this, but if we think about the successes of Japan, we have to think about to what degree the difference of Japan has contributed to the success. First of all, I must mention that there was the latecomer's benefit or advantage on the part of Japan. Japan received a technical transfer from the United States, and she successfully absorbed and digested this. When it comes to training and education of the workers, the American mode of placing a great amount of its importance on management towards these aspects was very much emphasized. This also was a latecomer's advantage. The next comes good fortunes. And what I would like to mention under good luck was the fact that military expenditure in Japan was kept low, and that the public expenditure on the part of Japan compared to the other advanced industrialized countries were rather small. These two factors are not necessarily linked to each other, but in any event, Japan was able to have small and cheap government, no doubt about that. So when we look at these facts in the 1960s, Japan's governmental expenditure was less than half than that of European nations and approximately 60% that of the United States. Now I call this good fortune. And there may be some criticism about that. The fact that Japan was able to keep her military expenditure low could be said to be of good policy, but I say that this was due to simple good luck that Japan did not have to expend large monies for military purposes. One perhaps can say that the other countries were less fortunate. So this was a matter of good luck and not a matter of being different. Furthermore, as to the other aspects of good fortunes, we found that large numbers of small-medium enterprises in Japan becoming very dynamic in the 1970s. But once again here, when I was in the university, we often took up this issue of the small-medium enterprises as constituting a dual structure of the economy. What used to be a burden suddenly one day became an asset, so to speak. And once again, I cannot help but say that this was good luck. It seems like good fortunes seem to play a very large role in the fortunes of a country. But the greatest luck was that the oil crisis of the 1960s brought about consensus on the part of the Japanese citizenry and gave a goal to which the Japanese people strenuously tried to attain. At the beginning, of course, we didn't think that this was good luck, but it was a blessing in disguise, so to speak. I say this was good fortunes on the part of Japan because at that time, energy conservation, materials conservation, or new electronic technology increasingly became more widespread. And right at the time when such technological innovation was becoming increasingly disseminated, Japan was able to switch her industrial structure to a new kind of a structure which was more energy saving. So for my third point, as to the success of Japan, we can say that Japan was able to successfully cope with the calls of the day. Now, what is left would then be the difference of Japan. As for such differences, for example, the close cooperation between the public sector and the private sector and the export policy that resulted thereof, or the in-house unions and lifetime employment system which made such unions possible have been listed. The stability and the relative long-term time horizons adopted by the management would be another factor, or the close sense of relationship and loyalty that has been bred by a feudalistic sort of orientation. But to these points too, I must mention that whether these factors are completely not found abroad, perhaps a detailed analysis would show that in the same manner we cannot find the exact same equivalent, but when it comes to thrift and exerting great amount of efforts towards industrialization, all countries have to go through that phase. Even Haldun, a very famous, should I say, Arabian man of thought, took up this issue of the rise and fall of the nations, and he said that when countries are on the rise, diligence and a good amount of effort would be critical. So I think this would be a common feature amongst all countries. So to a considerable degree, what was often cited to be different aspects of Japan is merely an issue of time lag. If I can explain that with the success of industrialization, such elements will increasingly disappear and they will not be sustained forever. As for the long-term time horizon of the Japanese management, 2 decades ago, maybe 3 decades ago, perhaps that was the case, but recently, when I look at the Japanese companies, I cannot feel that they have a long-term perspective. The Japanese people are still very diligent, but maybe 20 years, 30 years henceforward, the situation would change. So what I think is important along this line is the fact that due to the defeat of the war, that there has been a complete cutoff from the pre-war mentality, and that an atmosphere that everyone must try hard for the collective good, not in the pre-war form of virtue, but a new kind of virtue was continued to be seen here in this country. In this connection, let me mention about an American man of thought, Mr. Veblen. And Mr. Veblen in 1915 mentioned about the opportunity of Japan. In this thesis, Mr. Veblen mentioned that Japan was industrially very strong, but the strength of Japan was due to feudalistic virtues still remaining, and that through industrialization she succeeded materialistic, and that came together in a synergistic manner to make for the strength of Japan. Furthermore, Veblen goes on to say that these kind of situations were seen in the European countries, that perhaps the degree of success was rather remarkable in the case of Japan, but it was not unique to Japan. The fact that Japan succeeded in her industrialization was the fact that it proved the commonality in the basics involved. For example, the fact that Japan went through a feudalistic era, or that in Japan there was a subtle but a very evident manner of coping with diversity. And in the ancient age, this was arrived from the fact that many peoples came to Japan, and there was a lot of cultural exchange with other countries, common also with the European countries. So same kinds of facts can be seen in the same context, and if one does that kind of an exercise, one arrives at the same conclusion. That's what Dr. Veblen mentioned. For Japan to further promote industrialization, it was mentioned that sooner or later such feudalistic virtues would become weakened and disappear, that human relations are bound to change. Why is this? Because industrialization needs a certain degree of communications, needs a certain level of education, and needs a certain amount of autonomy and independence. And once you go in the process of industrialization, such unique culmination of several factors cannot continue forever. This opportunity of Japan, this title itself indicates that Japan in the long term would become an ordinary country, a commonplace country, but that maybe over a century or so, Japan would be able to draw upon her feudalistic virtues and the industrialization process. And I found Dr. Veblen's thesis very interesting. Perhaps Dr. Bell would be a better person to mention about this, but Saint-Simon also has mentioned about saying that. Comte Saint-Simon mentioned this, and Comte mentioned this. Overall, I think this situation in Japan can be mentioned to a large degree by time lag. So in any event, such unique or different aspects will not go on forever, and over a very long time span, issues that we cannot think can be immediately resolved of can, in the final analysis, be overcome. Then, to what degree can industrial societies move in the same direction? What kind of time lags are involved? And what would be the last remaining differences or uniqueness? That, I think, is an interesting intellectual exercise. I think something will remain, but what that something would be is a very important intellectual point of thought. Let me go on to my second point.
The question of this difference cannot be denied totally. I approve of it in part, but more importantly, I do see the present problems as arising from the massive set of changes since the 1970s, which have created the problems that we have today. What are these colossal massive changes? I still don't know, to be frank. I can point out a few things, e.g. the oil shock or oil crisis and massive energy saving efforts that pursued. In the case of Japan, this had twofold impact. On Japan, first, imports expanded because of the oil crisis. And as the imports rose, we had to finance them by stepping up our exports. So we had increased our exports. You know full well that after the Second World War and through 1980s, the exports as a share of GNP was around 13%, pretty much constant for these ages. Then in 1986, it rose to 17.5%, a 4 percentage point increase. So this change is quite significant. Prior thereto, in 1980, imports rose by about 3%. So in this sense, because of the expensive energy imports, Japan had to make extra efforts to finance them. This was a major motivating factor. However, since then, as we succeeded in energy saving efforts, the oil price came down, and even before they began coming down, the prices of raw materials, natural resources were generally tending downward anyway. Perhaps as technologies are developed, we human beings are becoming less, in fact, and less on natural resources. For Japan, was it good luck? It was a good luck. Perhaps it was too much of a good luck. We had anticipated energy prices would continue to be high, so we stepped our exports and energy prices came down. Thus, we generated huge surpluses in trade, on the trade account. In this sense, the relationship between resources and the real economy have changed. The same thing worked in a negative way to the Americans. America does not export oil, but it does export much primary commodities, agricultural products and so on. Their prices came down too. When Japan was spending less and less, when at the same time Americans were expending more and more, earning less and less. That was a misfortune for Americans. At that time, triggered by the so-called oil dollar or whatever, there began to arise a major change in the world financial circles or financial scene. The financial system institution in the world had to be maintained by the Americans, which ended up rather costly. Please recall that 13 some years ago, right after oil shock, recycling was the greatest concern to all of us. If recycling wasn't done well, the world will plunge into depression. We will all argue, concerned about that. But that did not take place because in America, the banks saw to it that money be recycled. But some money ended up in not economically efficient ways. The upshot was what happened in Latin America, accumulated massive debt. Latin America, as you know, is an important export market for American industrial products. America, therefore, had to live with reduced earnings, export earnings in Latin America. Japan is surrounded by needs. Frankly speaking, the Japanese had not expected the needs to come to the fore some 20 years ago. So we have a big happy surprise, a new market. So this needs constitutes a third important matter of good luck. This decade of the 1970s, in another important way, was a decade when the Soviet power began expanding in the latter half of the decade. In 1979, the Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan. In retrospect, how silly was it? They did something utterly unnecessary, we would all argue. But what I like to emphasize is that the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and the United States didn't do anything to prevent it actually. And the Soviets learned their own, would the Soviets still have learned their folly if the Americans didn't do anything? But then this would be too much to expect of the humanity. The Soviet expansion was something that the Japanese and the Europeans certainly had to cope with. If the Russians had taken different course of policy action in the 70s, the world affairs may have been smoother. Well, there's no crying over the spilled milk. But anyway, the Americans had to spend far more to check the Russians in Afghanistan. That ended up very costly to all of us. So that was, and up until now is the closing phase of the age of the Cold War. So as we look back into the 1970s, Neither was Japan a villain, nor was America, but there were a set of drastic changes which worked in favor of the Japanese economy and in disfavor of the American economy. That, I think, is the bottom line. There are inequalities, unfairness in the affairs of men and women. These things do happen. I have just drawn a very quick sketch of what has taken place in the world as I saw it. But these are things we have to keep in mind. But what I have mentioned is not very comprehensive, because in the meanwhile, during this period, the role of governments has been changing too. The nature of the government's work has been changing. Deregulations, for example. But these are all very hard to define. How are governments in various nations changing? This is a very slippery, elusive animal. What I want to emphasize is, in about the middle of the 1970s, people in those days thought with the energy crisis and stagflation, and on top of it, mounting Russian threat, these to the people in the 70s were the major concerns. They argued. Most people had agreed to them, or at least didn't raise any questions. But these problems have been rather neatly solved. That should give us some sense of confidence. However, we have dealt with them pretty neatly, but at some considerable cost to the Americans. And we have not completed our adjustment with all these changes. We have a lot more homework to do. That is my reading of the present situation. I want to give as an example the changes over the last few decades, and I submit it is important to exercise intellectually what are the problems, nature of the problems, or what are the importances. I'm no one to say that I'm the one who can offer the neatest blueprints for our intellectual exercise, but this type of perception of the reality is important for both the Japanese and Americans, because between our two peoples there are a lot of noises, arguments. While the situation has changed so drastically, we seem to be still employing the old frame of reference, an intellectual error, an error in intellectual exercise. For example, in the 1970s, let's say there was no trade imbalance between our two countries. Let's say the governments have liberalized their institutions, and still there are imbalances. And therefore, some argue the Americans are to blame. Some people do that. Statistically, this argument may be supported by figures. However, if we all agree that there were indeed massive changes in the 70s, we should first and foremost address ourselves to these problems instead of blaming unilaterally America, without understanding why America had taken some of the policy that it had. Now, on the Americans, the kinds of rules that prevailed in the past could stay, and if, in other words, we have some return to normalcy now that the Cold War is over, and therefore if you can argue that we can go back to the old rules and the old customs, that should be the solution in the eyes of many people. But in the past dozen or so years, the world has changed so much, requiring a new types and new degrees of efforts. We cannot not just reinstitute old set of rules to the present situation and then blame people for different wrongdoings or omissions. So the accurate perception of the changes that have taken place in the last decade or two is very, very urgently needed. What should the politicians or state political leadership do? Let me give it some thought. First, what are real problems? That is first what we must first think about. What are the real problems? The real problem must be an important one. Second, a real problem must be something practical, pragmatic, that you can do something practical about it. Like American criticism of Japan. Let's take it as an example. The Japanese agriculture should be opened, so goes the argument. Agricultural security or food independence cannot be founded, so goes the argument. I think this argument is in error. I don't think it is such a crucially important matter in terms of the deficit. I don't really subscribe to that agricultural independence argument that Japan needs to be independent food-wise. But it is true that every country in the government pays some subsidies for its agricultural production. And from the viewpoint of fairness of subsidies, this problem may be solved. Economically, it is not so important as it is portrayed, and yet it generates such major psychological repercussions when people overseas complain of Japanese agricultural closeness. Why is it? We have been taking up only the visible symptoms without really evaluating the magnitude of the problems. Now, suppose if we take up more important problems, can they be solved? I'm now raising the question of feasibility of a solution. Some of the most important problems can. We all agree that there were indeed massive changes in the 70s. We should first and foremost address ourselves to these problems instead of blaming unilaterally America, without understanding why America had taken some of the policy that it had. Now, on the Americans, the kinds of rules that prevailed in the past could stay, and if, in other words, we have some return to normalcy now that the Cold War is over, and therefore if you can argue that we can go back to the old rules and the old customs, that should be the solution in the eyes of many people. But in the past dozen or so years, the world has changed so much, requiring a new types and new degrees of efforts. We cannot not just reinstitute old set of rules to the present situation and then blame people for different wrongdoings or omissions. So the accurate perception of the changes that have taken place in the last decade or two is very, very urgently needed. What should the politicians or state political leadership do? Let me give it some thought. First, what are real problems? That is first what we must first think about. What are the real problems? A real problem must be an important one. Second, a real problem must be something practical, pragmatic, that you can do something practical about it. Like American criticism of Japan. Let's take it as an example. The Japanese agriculture should be opened, so goes the argument. Agricultural security or food independence cannot be founded, so goes the argument. I think this argument is in error. I don't think it is such a crucially important matter in terms of the deficit. I don't really subscribe to that agricultural independence argument that Japan needs to be independent food-wise. But it is true that every country in the government pays some subsidies for its agricultural production. And from the viewpoint of fairness of subsidies, this problem may be solved. Economically, it is not so important as it is portrayed, and yet it generates such major psychological repercussions when people overseas complain of Japanese agricultural closeness. Why is it? We have been taking up only the visible symptoms without really evaluating the magnitude of the problems. Now, suppose if we take up more important problems, can they be solved? I'm now raising the question of feasibility of a solution. Some of the most important problems cannot be solved, like balance of international payments deficit. There is no way, I don't think, to quickly fix it. And historically, imbalances have persisted for some periods of time, from time to time. What is important is, in the days of such deficits, certain disciplines are needed. What other disciplines have not been clearly agreed upon among the nations concerned? To me, on this question of balance of payments, the disciplines must be duly looked into and discussed and defined. I feel rather awkward about this, strange about this, with some deep feeling of sigh. There's this talk about a structural impediment initiative. The Japanese and Americans exchange a list of demands to each other. As I listen to this dialogue, I can't help but feel that both sides are right. Each side argues and feels that he or she is right, and the others are wrong. These are lucky people, happy people, but the world isn't that simple. Well, both sides are correct, but I said I sigh because you can't do any of the things they preach. For example, raise American savings rate. You can't do it. How do you do it? It's easy to talk about it. The Japanese streets are dirty, underdeveloped. Why don't you invest in infrastructure and industries? How can you do it? Strangely, these are the problems that, if seen from the best interest from each country, the problems that we are doing something that are against these interests. If Americans don't save, they don't invest less, they don't invest much, therefore they don't regain their competitiveness. In Japan, industrial investment has been lagging. In 20 or 30 years, our plants will be fairly obsolete. So we should be really investing in our infrastructure, urban amenities, and these to the Japanese should be really more important than investing in plants, actually, the social infrastructure. But then how do you finance them? How do you do it? One answer is laissez-faire. Don't do anything about it. Both sides, in fact, is doing what is against its best interest. So one day, both of us will come to their senses, I hope. But we may not have that time. We may not have luxury of that time. We live in the days of interdependence. So we can buy time by exporting your problems to outside for a while, but not for long. So that's what we have to do, something about it. If we are living in a world with a less degree of interdependence, with a less pace of change, it will be best for you to wait until you realize your own follies, that what you're doing is against your interest. But we don't have that time. We don't live in that kind of slow-moving world. There are difficulties in terms of foreign policy, diplomacy, if you like. Diplomacy is a matter of give and take. You demand this, and you will offer to do this. This is a bargain. That's diplomacy. But this cannot be practiced with any ease in economic interchange. Disarmament is easy. You dismantle SS-20s, okay? We'll demolish Pershing II. And intermediate ballistic missiles. It's all quite clear. You dismantle this much, we dismantle this much. But can we do the same in our economic dealings, economic interchanges? Nothing is so clear as in disarmament talk or arms reduction talk. If economy becomes more of a pivotal force in our economy, in the world, and if we become thoroughly interdependent, what can diplomacy do to us? What should diplomacy do? I know there are very few, if any, precedences for such diplomacy. In the past, we had never thought about this because we had never stepped into that kind of economic arena. The diplomats and government leaders felt this is a matter of sovereign rights. And I hate to talk about sovereign rights very lightly. Interest rates and fiscal policy and everything today no single nation has complete sovereignty. So it's silly to talk about one's own sovereign rights. But having said that, what kind of diplomacy should we carry out to try to solve these economic conflicts? We have very little experience. In the olden days, you listed merchandise, products. All right, we'll liberalize this group of merchandise. We'll reduce the import duties by 20%, or whatever percentage. But adjusting economic policies is far more difficult than that. To me, a scholar in diplomacy, international relations, can't just see how you do it. I don't quite understand how that can be done. This is how I see, and maybe that's why nothing is being achieved or advanced with a scholar like me saying this thing. So, having said that, yet, let me add that if we concentrate our attention to a short list of some urgent problems, maybe we can exchange views and come to certain agreements, like some kind of an agreement on mutual or respective economic policies. That may be possible. That probably should be made possible. Finally, why we have not been able to do this and why I am pessimistic. This is because of the nature of both governments. I think the quality of our two governments has been deteriorating. In America, the government is more and more subject to pressure groups. It carries a heavy budget deficit, and they don't seem to be very enthusiastic about solving it. In the case of Japan, we join other countries, but we don't do anything on our own initiative. We don't step forward ahead of other countries in doing anything good, at least in the past 6 years. Anything passed by the lower house has not been always passed or approved by the upper house. Other than that, I don't have much worry. Japan and America have superior intellectual prowess, and we have good history of exchanging views, comparing our notes. Problems are difficult, but gradually, taking time, slowly, we can move toward solutions. But let us be aware of the weakening political leaderships in both countries, in America and in Japan. This, to me, is a really cause of worry. Generally, I'm an optimistic man, but the more and more problems, the happier I am. But at this moment, I can enjoy discussing these problems, but at the same time, I do feel some of these problems may not really ever be solved. That's the end of my comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The special feature of Dr. Kosaka's style of analysis is to look with precision at the facts of the matter, and on the other hand, to take a perceptive analysis in context of history. I think his presentation was a good culmination of the two sides. Dr. Kosaka always talks about human destiny, or the destiny of humanity, and a very wise sense of letting it be, and at the same time an optimism of not giving up on humanity or the destiny of human beings was being reflected by the outstanding speech that was given this morning. I think the tone of the panel discussion has been set by Dr. Kosaka. The presentation gave us a lot of food for thought, and as to how we are going to proceed, perhaps we can take up the analysis of the facts, ask Dr. Kosai to give us his views, and then move on to a historical perspective, ask Dr. Bell for his views, and then ask comments from the other panelists. Dr. Kosai, please.
Thank you. Listening to Professor Kosaka's comments, I have come to feel that I'm in agreement with him that we have more of problems rather than less between Japan and the United States. But practically speaking, why is it that we must confront with each other in so many ways? What is the reason for these conflicts. I'm not quite sure about the reason behind the proliferation of problems. Naturally, Professor Kosaka argues that the balance of international payments and balance of trade are the cause. He went back to the 70s for the cause. Basically, I submit that his explanation is sound. But because of balance of payments imbalance or disequilibrium, he says we have problems, but I don't think we have clear base for that thought. Fluctuating floating rate of exchanges, volatility with accompanying that. What is the imbalance in international payments? Why is it that we must confront each other because of such imbalances? Yes, there are imbalances, but Japan's exports, I don't think, are generating unemployment in America. In America, unemployment is only 5%. You cannot argue, therefore, that Japan is causing unemployment in America. In fact, if we don't export to America, America may suffer inflation. The Japanese capital goes to the United States. Without it, the U.S. would have to raise interest rates. That would not be in the American interest, certainly. So, under the floating rate of exchange and the free mobility of capital, what's wrong about some disequilibria in the balance of international payments? I don't think that's totally clear. Second matter. Balance of payments deficits between the US and Japan, our two countries, are seeing weaknesses. Japan this year, in terms of current account deficit, it's going to be considerably lower than the previous year. As a rate of to GNP, by the end of 1985, it was about close to 5% current account deficit of Japan, of GNP. This year, it will be down to probably 2% plus. So, if it's less than 2%, the current account deficit as percentage of GNP, I don't think it's any correction. The current account surplus in the case of Japan, we cannot say it's any massive surplus if it's only 2% or so of GNP. Yes, between our two countries, we do have imbalances, disequilibria, but the US, vis-a-vis the EC and the Asian needs, it has been reducing import surpluses. That's why Japan's imbalance with Japan today is more conspicuous than before. But US exports to Japan today are increasing very rapidly. And you cannot argue that Japanese market is closed when in fact America is exporting more and more to the Japanese market. Now, suppose if the balance of payments is not the major culprit for our problems, why are we confronting each other so much? There are problems, but we are solving them one by one. Both countries are making the efforts in the goodwill. I don't think there's much more that we can do that than what we're doing. But basically, why must we at loggerheads? Back in the 1930s, there were reasons that we should have been at loggerheads. But today, Japan is not objecting to the US blueprint for the world affairs or the world system. So one by one, if you take up problems like that, maybe they're not much of problems, except possibly one. That is the Japanese-American competition in technology, seeking technological superiority. Americans generally are reluctant to concede to the Japanese technical or technological superiority. If that be indeed the American government policy, then I could see rather vehement conflict in seeking technological superiority between the two countries. But we are not seeking technical superiority in every aspect. There are many areas in which America is clearly far ahead of Japan in terms of technological superiority. And Japan can hardly think about maintaining or creating technical superiority in every aspect in the future. Certainly not. So my comment is, the basic problem here is we have community of interest, commonality of interest, like peeling of onions. You remove one layer of the onion, one after another. Maybe you find no hard core in the middle of the onion. I think maybe we should recognize that between our two countries. That is my comment number one. Comment number two, related to it. Professor Kosaka talked about difference in constitution. The Japan is so different from others. Yes, there are differences, but when we have so much friction, I think these frictions should give us a good opportunity for us. What is taking place between us is not frictions arising from us seeking to become similar, but as we are to create new societies, Japan and America are comparing notes intellectually as to what are the better societies for our future. That's why we are discussing, that's why we are arguing, that's why the conflicts. If so, those conflicts and the frictions may be something very healthy or wholesome or constructive. Now, if we take that view, then I come to this last hardcore, the technological superiority or search of technological superiority. Even there, I think we can find a path for cooperation and collaboration. I sound rather idealistic, but I do think that once again we should find ourselves on this kind of idealistic ground and see what we can do to cooperate with each other, to jointly produce new technologies. Then confrontation would not be very serious at all. In fact, taking that sort of ideological approach can reduce the seriousness of that kind of problems. Thank you, Professor Kosai. Professor Daniel Bell, with his ideology, historical ideology, has influenced us a lot. But he's giving more and more thought to the matter of technology, I think. Professor Kosai said that Japan and US can productively cooperate with each other, seeking better, more advanced technology. Perhaps we can benefit from Dr. Bell's insight. Thank you. Dr. Bell?
Let me say first how pleased I am to be here again, particularly in respect to this framework of bridges. I came here many years ago as a guest. Now, having enjoyed the cooperation so long with the Suntory Foundation, I feel now as a friend. And I think the transition from guest to friend is one kind of bridge that I personally appreciate. And I certainly salute the leadership of Professor Yamazaki in creating that bridge for me. Let me go to the more broad question that has been raised by Professor Kosaka. I think that Professor Kosai is probably quite correct in his details, but sometimes the question is not so much the details, but the shape of the forest. And if I can take a moment or two, I would like to go back to something I said perhaps about 10 years or so ago in one of the early symposia of the Suntory Foundation in trying to provide a framework for analysis of the tensions at the time. And I said that there were 4 different axes, 4 different kinds of conflicts which were taking place simultaneously, though some were more important than others. The 4 were, first of all, East versus West in the sense of the United States as against the Soviet Union. And there the competition was political, military, and ideological. But along with East versus West, there was also West versus West, which was primarily economic, to some extent between the United States and Germany and the United States and Japan, thinking of Japan as an OECD country and therefore within that Western frame. A third axis was North versus South, where the conflicts were economic and ideological. And the fourth axis was East versus East, China versus the Soviet Union. And I tried to use that as a framework for analysis to understand the multiplicity of conflicts which are taking place in that period of time. I think we can certainly agree that in one respect, the Cold War has changed considerably. At least the ideological thrust of communism has by now totally disappeared. Whether the Soviet Union can still keep the historic elements of expansionism, which is part of its history, remains to be seen. That, however, is quite doubtful, at least for the next 10 years or so, given the huge economic difficulties. In a curious way, if I look back at that framework of analysis, Japan now has two reprieves. When I say reprieves, meaning that they are breathing spaces which have been created by these breakdowns of this framework. Namely, the fact that the Soviet Union is increasingly more preoccupied with its own internal problems, which it may not be able to manage, means that the pressures for military budgets become reduced for everybody, including Japan. And some of the debates which have taken place only recently in Japan about the possibility or even the need to increase military budgets can perhaps now be slowed down. Secondly, the difficulties in China, which could have become an extraordinary economic competitor in some ways, as well as a market, probably again, for at least 5 to 10 years, is a breathing space insofar as the Chinese will not be able to institutionalize a degree of economic and political reform. So to that extent, the old framework of analysis is broken down, and I think Professor Kosaka is perfectly right in saying we need a new framework of analysis to understand what is happening. Let me propose not a complete one, but at least the outlines of one. And it goes back to a theme which Professor Kosaka has put forward and which Professor Kosai has mentioned, namely interdependence. But again, what is missing here sometimes is this. The interdependence is very largely and increasingly economic. The interdependence had been political when it was military in its form, when the United States needed Japan and Japan needed the United States. So there's both economic and political interdependence. There is less political interdependence at the time when economic interdependence is growing more strongly. But one thing comes out very clearly when you begin to see the conflicts between economics and politics. Mr. Kosai has said, what is wrong with capital moving about freely? Because after all, this is one of the important technological developments of the last 10 years. We see how quickly capital can move. But if one stands back, it also is clear that while capital can move freely, people cannot. And since people cannot move as freely as capital, the need to protect their ways of life become strong. Just as even within Japan, the rice farmers do not want to change a way of life, even though economically, sometimes, it may make more sense for the society. And one has to admit the strength of the people's needs to deal with their own ways of life and often to resist that. In other words, there's no good reason to give capital entirely a blank check. The lives of people also matter. Now, if people cannot move as freely as capital, the distribution of resources will follow a different pattern than the distribution of jobs. And I think, and that perhaps is purely a guess, I hope an informed guess, that in the next 10 years or so, we probably will see a rising tide of protectionism around the world. Everybody talks free trade. There is now the GATT round, which is moving to deal with services and agriculture, although they are fumbling on the definition of what is an illegal or legal subsidy for agriculture. But I think despite the rhetoric of free trade, it is clear that protectionism is rising. James Baker, when he was the Secretary of Treasury in the Reagan administration, made a speech which was largely overlooked, in which he said if we look back at the last 10 years or 8 years of the Reagan administration, there was more protectionism in American economic policy than at any time since World War II. More, in field after field, in terms of import quotas, pressures to restrict various kinds of entry of goods, etc. And this has been a basic fact. Why? Simply the need for protection of people. It's not just a matter of pressure groups per se. That is the political manifestation. It's simply the sentiments of people and the apprehensions of people. One may say quite rightly that perhaps if one looks at the fundamentals, these fears are exaggerated. And that is true purely from an economic point of view. But people are not wholly rational, and understandably so. They think of their communities, they think of their lives, their jobs, their churches, their institutions, and they want to protect them. I think what is happening in Europe is interesting for the same reason. We now talk of 1992, but we forget that the European idea with the common market began in 1957. Why in the last few years has it suddenly accelerated? Some of it came from the fact that perhaps unwisely, some Japanese was saying, well, Europe is finished. Even Mr. Kissinger said Europe is finished. And some people said Europe will be a museum or a boutique for the rest of the world. And the Europeans reacted. Although the Europeans say there will not be a fortress Europe, that is not completely true. In at least 6 or 7 fields, one sees rising protectionism. Already in Europe, there's the fact that people are asking for a larger transitional period to keep out Japanese cars, which is one reason why Toyota and Nissan are racing furiously to build new plants in England and France. Agriculture, of course, is an old problem of subsidy. Steel is a problem. Now television programming. As you have the breakup of the old monopolies of the states, you've had an explosion of broadcasting, about 6 times as many hours as before. And you have, therefore, an effort to keep out American programming. In semiconductors and other fields, you have now local content rules which apply across the area. And this, too, will keep out many other non-European products. The United States has been moving, originally without a plan, towards a North American continent, uniting Canadian resources and cheaper Mexican labor in the so-called Maquiladora area, which is a band below the border. And I think, despite its own protests, a yen bloc is also emerging. Japan now does more trade with Asia, or the rest of Asia, than it does with the United States. The investments in Thailand, Malaysia, and other places moving ahead very rapidly. We are seeing perhaps, there are many cross currents, but we're seeing perhaps the emergence of continental blocs as a way of protecting people within these areas. It's for this reason, I think, not so much of talking about optimism or pessimism, but trying to define and understand the contrasting and conflicting currents of economics and politics. We all want to be optimistic, but I sometimes think of the story of a famous old rabbi who was standing at the edge of heaven when the world was created, and the angels were celebrating the work of the Lord. And one danced up to the rabbi and said, "Rabbi, isn't this wonderful what the Lord has done? Look what he has created. Are you optimistic or pessimistic?" The rabbi looked at the smiling faces of the angels, very beatific, and said, "I am optimistic." Then he looked down at the world. And the angel said, "Tell me, if you are optimistic, why are you scowling so? Why are you making such a grim face?" The rabbi said, "To tell you the truth, I don't think that my optimism is justified."
Thank
you very much.
人間の関係の問題
When we look at the matter of human relations, it is a different dimension from products or money, that it is quite natural that psychology plays a very large part in the human affairs. I recalled of a very trivial example. Sony has invested in Columbia Pictures, or should I say have acquired Columbia Pictures. That in itself is not a bad thing. Next, Mitsubishi Realty invested and bought shares of the Rockefeller real estate company, which owns the Rockefeller building. But these two cases appeared in quick succession in the U.S. press, and I wondered whether perhaps this was something that could have been averted by human wisdom. Or perhaps it is a matter of, as Dr. Kosai would put it, a matter of good luck or bad luck. That's the kind of issue that confronts us now. Concerning the Japanese side and the American side, we have looked at society in human sentiment and psychology. And let me now call upon Dr. Herbert Passam that has looked at these matters in detail. I would like to talk about the uniqueness aspect. I am a sociologist by title, but I am a specialist in social anthropology. And as a social anthropologist, I would have to look at the relationship between society and culture, that there is a unique relationship between the two. Throughout my days as a university student, I have always been biased towards that kind of an orientation. But at the same time, no matter what society, no matter what culture, no matter which country, in spite of the differences or uniquenesses, there are commonalities that we are all humanity. And that's common sense amongst anthropologists. It's a matter of balance. That is to say, commonality and uniqueness, striking a good balance. If you emphasize too much one side, you come up with problems, be it political problems or psychological problems. And if you emphasize the commonality too much, then a different set of issues would arise. So it's a matter of balance. In the advanced countries, I think this issue is becoming increasingly an urgent matter. And as a social anthropologist, I feel a bit strange that I would have to refer to such issues in this context. The United States, from some time in the past, has had the strong feeling that it is a unique country. In the 19th century, and probably right up to quite recent, and maybe even now, the United States has always expounded that she is unique or different. And that's a very famous thought pattern amongst historians. Dr. Bell has written about that issue too, and just recently in an article he has mentioned that the end of the American uniqueness or the differences of the United States. It was a very interesting article that Dr. Bell has written. In Japan, on the other hand, there has been often thoughts expressed that she is unique, and that in itself is not something to be surprised. As Dr. Kosaka has mentioned, both sides are right. Certainly we have differences, and we also have common features. We have to admit to that. Now there is one point that bothers me about this uniqueness or difference issue. recently, in order to avoid the main issues, the blame is put on differences. That is to say, rather than casting a hard, dispassionate eye on the domestic issues of the United States, the blame is put on Japan, that Japan is not playing the same game, or that she is abiding by different rules, even if she claims to be in the same game. This means that you don't have to go into any soul-searching within one's heart about one's own wrongdoings. Conversely speaking, such anti-Japanese sentiments are becoming strong, and although I deplore that situation, we always have to look into the roots of where these issues have come up from. It seems like the Japanese have consistently always asserted that they were different, and it seems like the Japanese arguments have now been taken over by the American side, giving rise to different prejudices. And it has become a justification for the criticisms that the United States has leveled against Japan, that at the root of this Japan is different sort of an idea is the fact that the Japanese themselves have always asserted that they were different and unique. The Japanese have always said that because of the unique circumstances of Japan, that Japan was able to do certain things. And this kind of an exposition was rather eye-catching on the part of the Japanese. And there is one aspect which calls for further self-reflection on the part of Japanese concerning this theory of uniqueness. That is to say, uniqueness has become a sort of an excuse of trying to avoid looking within oneself, that is, for trying to avoid introspection. There is another point that I would like to mention. When you look at the history of the world just until recently, we find scattered phenomena. That is to say, that for each of the cultures, each of the countries, that the course of history seemed to be moving independently. But quite evident recently is the fact that although with a certain amount of breadth, that the currents of history seem to be coming together. And most probably this starts from modern history. And I'm not specifying here modern history as being French history or Japanese history or the history of the United States. Although not completely disappearing, the issue of being different, uniqueness, and commonalities cannot be ignored. But when you look at the world as of late, just as Dr. Kosaka has demonstrated, things are quite different from the past. And within this framework of change, what is common is the move toward an international society of sorts, or an international culture of sorts. When you look at various fields, and you don't have to look specifically at, for example, science and technology of Japan, or culture of Japan, or arts of Japan. It's rather a more international style, so to say, and to search for such international style. Although there may be some unique elements, all countries seem to be moving in the same direction. So a new international society or culture seems to be emerging. I think we have to keep that in the corner of our minds. Looking at commonality or universality versus uniqueness. Although this is a very interesting framework of thought, to try to put that as the basic assumption for the argument of trying to capture politics would, I think, be a major hindrance as to self-introspection of each country. We are now thinking in the context of the Pacific, and of course, as a contrast, we would have to think about the Atlantic. When we look back at history, the region of the Atlantic has been brought about by the European culture, which arose within that context. In contrast to that, the Pacific has, in terms of traditional cultures, has been one in which diversity or differences met each other. It was in the 20th century that the Pacific era came into being, and because of this issue of modernization became another common denominator in this region. And probably this was different from the region of the Atlantic, because this issue of modernization with the common thread in the Pacific was something that was born upon the experiences of the Atlantic region. In that respect, Dr. Passam's view were very suggestive. And once again, it goes back to what Dr. Kosai mentioned, that an international society, a community, should be contemplated centering around common technology. Mr. Funabashi is an expert on China affairs, and he has written outstanding books on China. And on the other hand, as an economic journalist, he has been in the United States and back in Japan. He is the head of the economics desk, and he is well versed in U.S.-Japan economic relations and economic matters at large. May we now call upon Mr. Funabashi.
Thank you. Professor Kosaka provided very intellectually stimulating keynote talk. I will try to emulate his example and extend